So please help me give a warm welcome to Jeremy Glassenberg. He is the product management lead of APIs at Docusign. Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, good to see you again. Good to meet y'all.
Yay! Thanks for making it to Interface.
Thanks for having me. Always happy to help out at API Days. Shall we get started?
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to hearing about scaling APIs for enterprises. This is going to be great.
All right, let's get rolling then. So thank y'all for joining. As mentioned, I'm Jeremy Glassenberg. I think you may have seen on the schedule a slight adjustment. This was about DeFi and scaling APIs. The focus of my topic, actually, it's less about DeFi, less about Web3. It's really more about when you are at an enterprise company, you have many teams building APIs. How do you manage that? Basically, it's around API governance. There were some good talks yesterday on API governance as well. This is kind of a continuation of that, focusing on the tools that can really help you to automate the planning and enforcement of API standards for a growing enterprise. I also should clarify, I am a product lead at Docusign. I am not just the product lead. There are many product folk at Docusign working on APIs, and I just have one component to it. It's been great there working with the many experts in APIs over there. Anywho, we'll do a quick about me. Basically, I work at Docusign today on APIs over there. But I've been working as a PM for APIs for a little over 14 years now. The companies I'm most well known for are Box and Tradeshift. I joined these two companies very early on. They're now billion-dollar-plus companies. And there, from the ground up, we worked on getting APIs designed well, getting them to the developer community, getting apps built. But ever since, I've worked at larger and larger companies, both full-time as an advisor and as a consultant. And I've seen the challenges as you get from going from a good API to scaling that as you wind up with many, many teams now working on APIs. I've seen this as an advisor. I've seen this as a consultant. I do also advise many startups through HeavyBit. Companies like Mosif and Open Channel were companies I advised in the past, so I've had a lot of experience in general in the API space. The focus today is what happens really next. You got a solid API, your company's grown now, and how do you really manage and maintain the quality of your APIs? Now, again, the focus today is more around the tooling to help with that topic of API governance. We're going to talk a little bit about the principles of API governance and also just general tools to help with the world of APIs. I am alluding a little bit to a previous talk I gave on just automating the API design and implementation process. To keep it brief there, I'd just like to highlight how, thanks to really the magic of the Open API schema, it's a lot easier than it used to be to design, build, launch, and maintain APIs with a solid developer experience. Tools built around the Open API schema include, the auto generation of API documentation, mock servers, API libraries. Having tools around Open API allows you to have API monitoring set up and configured more easily. It basically lets you set up your API with less implementation, even less code, if you're using the right API gateway as well. And then also with API editors, it's easier than ever to actually plan and design your API and test it to make sure it's of good quality. These tools help teams to connect into your CI/CD pipeline to further automate the process of implementing and maintaining your APIs. In fact, many teams have learned with the magic of Open API, you can even automatically generate APIs right off your backend system, right off your database. That said, when it comes to auto-generating APIs themselves, I'm one who really advocates the other approach to API development, what's known as design-first principles. Or as I also like to say, just applying the product management process to APIs, determining really the points of value for your developer platform. How are you creating value for your customers and your partner developers or your customer developers? Determining what sort of applications your developer community is actually going to build with your APIs, and then accordingly planning how your API should be designed to make all of this as easy as possible. And then from there, going into the actual development of your API, just as you would for any customer product, and having a launch plan to ensure a good customer, in our case, a good developer experience. It's basically just saying that your developer is a customer, and so you should design your technical functionality, your APIs, to make it as easy for them to work with you. And the tools around OpenAPI today, really over the last 4 or 5 years, help to automate design-first principles as well. They help you to design your API according to use case, test your designs before building them, and then when you're ready to launch, to make sure you have that solid developer experience with libraries and documentation. So you can apply these tools either to auto-generate your APIs, or even if you're applying those design-first principles, really use all these tools to design APIs according to use case. But today we're talking about the next level challenge. So your company has a solid process of getting APIs out that are a good fit for your developers, well-designed, working well, and then your company is successful and they're growing. And now you have more teams with more products, each of which has its own APIs, its own set of APIs. When that happens, even if you've been able to apply really good design principles, not just RESTful design, but those design-first principles, this other challenge arises: API consistency, where individual teams will really have to build, maintain, and launch their own high-quality APIs. But how do you get those APIs to work together? You may wind up with different teams, each of which are creating great APIs, but when you're trying to build an app that works across your products, you can start to see the challenges. Maybe the means of authenticating users is different, or the output, the response you get from one set of APIs, well, they're very different from the responses and inputs in another set of APIs. So if I want to build an app that works between my products, I may have to put in some extra effort to handle some data transformations just to work across a company's own products. This isn't ideal, but it happens even if you have solid design principles. And here's where we realize that designing APIs for scale, it's more than just designing them for usability and for backwards compatibility. What do you do when the APIs can start to get naturally disjoint with the growth of your company in a way that's not the fault of any individual team that's working on APIs? I've seen this challenge for well over a decade. It came up years ago for larger tech companies like Google. Once upon a time, even just within Google Workspace, I worked on an integration that involved Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Google Slides. I discovered that just to upload documents into Google Docs or upload a spreadsheet to Google Spreadsheets and open up an editor interface, it was actually different in how you did it with Google Docs and Google Sheets. Now, the issue for Google Workspace was exacerbated by the fact that Google had acquired 3 different companies for what's now within Google Drive. Google Docs was Writely, Google Sheets was iRose, Google Slides, I forget the name of the company, but they were actually 3 different products from 3 different companies who were consequently going to have different APIs. And Google quickly realized that things were getting disjoint, and they needed a way just for Google across the board between these acquisitions and these new teams to get teams aligned on how they design their APIs. Now, when I was working at a startup at the time, I was thinking, wow, I'm glad I'm not dealing with that issue. But things have evolved in the tech world over many years, and especially just in the last 3-4 years, where suddenly we have many companies that used to be those billion-dollar unicorns suddenly being $10 billion plus companies. They've grown massively in value, and they've also grown headcount. And suddenly they have multiple teams with new products all working on different APIs, when they used to have just one team working on APIs. And so this challenge has become more common, the challenge of designing APIs going beyond good design and REST, and that need to have a set of standards for the many API product teams at your company to use. And doing so really isn't easy. I have to emphasize that in practice, you have to first accept that you no longer have one team defining APIs for your entire company. You will need to allow each team to have that autonomy to manage their own APIs while still keeping them aligned. And to get a process in place to allow for that sort of scale, we have to understand the need to establish standards that each team can use. Basically, each team will have authority, but going beyond just applying good API design principles, good REST principles, we start to create additional requirements, custom standards for our company. And we can define those. Now, when we define those requirements, and we should also ask, what is really the means by which we're defining those new requirements, these new standards? We also have the challenge of getting teams to actually adopt the standards. I have to also emphasize that in practice, if you want APIs to work well together across different products at your company, it's really important for teams to have a means of being able to share how their APIs work and how they're designed. So we're going to get into all these topics. How do you actually get the standard defined? How do you actually get teams aligned to those standards and to use the standards? And how do you make all this easier, and especially make it easy for teams to share what they're doing so that the models, the endpoints, are actually reusable? We'll first get into some, in principle and practice, what you have to do to get the standards going. But I also want to really focus today's talk on the tooling behind them. So let's first talk about just how do you get a standard. Across every company I've seen that's been in this position, at some point, they establish an API council of some kind. Basically, this is where you just get teams together it's basically meant to be a cross-team place of some kind where you can discuss various API topics. Not just the API standard, but this would be the place where you establish the API standard. We'll talk a little bit more about what exactly you have to do with an API council. But what I note here is that once you establish a standard through the council, and I'll share some general tips and tricks on that API council. I think much was discussed yesterday as well. There's creating the standard, and there are the tools around OpenAPI that do more than just help you design, implement, and launch an API. There are tools around OpenAPI that help you manage your own API standard. We'll get into that a bit, but let's talk a little bit more about that API council thing, which basically is the place we're going to be discussing the API standards and establishing the API standards. What I've seen when working with various large companies as they get to this point, as they start having to work on that standard, as they start decentralizing really the process of designing APIs, we find that's first important when you create this API council to make sure that you have stakeholders across your API product teams who can have a say. Basically, people in any team, within any team where they are launching external APIs, there should be someone who's able to contribute feedback to the council and criticize the standards that you have. I usually say the more the merrier when it comes to inviting people to your APIs. At the same time, you have to make sure the council has a structured approach to discussing and defining these API standards and taking them to something that's going to be enforced. So usually I say that for any product team at your company, once they have an external API, or they're going to have an external API, they should have at least one representative, a product rep or an engineering leader, ideally more than one person, at least from product and engineering or engineering leadership, who's there to represent. They're able to attend, they're able to listen, and they're able to share their own feedback and criticisms on your API designs. I don't have a good line for that. That's like no taxation without representation. It's a big thing. If we are paying taxes, we should at least have a vote on it. But I'm just going to then poorly copy that quote and say something like, no API design requirements without representation. But the principle is there. If we are going to try to get teams to adopt a standard, we do have to let them have a say in what the standard is. And so the council is meant to be an egalitarian approach. I find you then do still have a centralized team working on APIs. They're just not necessarily responsible with actually creating too many APIs. They're responsible for the standard, and they become more facilitators for the API standards, helpers for teams working on their own APIs who have the authority on those APIs. And what do we actually discuss in the council? Like, what should go into a standard? The API Council can discuss more than API standards, but since I'm more focused on the tools today, I just want to quickly highlight what you probably need to, at minimum, discuss to establish API standards. And that goes around some general rules on API endpoint definitions. How do you name your endpoints? How do you make sure that the endpoints all look similar? Modeling requirements, the underlying models for your APIs. How do you make them look and feel the same and ideally be reusable? Parameters, what are the rules for GET requests, POST requests? What are the rules for their names? Which parameters should be reusable? So that's, say, for pagination, for sorting. You have consistency across your APIs. Formatting issues like casing come up. So we have rules in general around your properties, your endpoints, your models, your parameters, and then across the board, making sure that casing is consistent across these, making sure you have rules around typing and formatting. What sort of formats are permissible? What numeric formats are permissible? Do you allow for min and max? Do you allow for patterns in your API definition? And then also setting up the standards that you also can have a set of models, endpoints, and properties that you define to say, please use these models. Please, when you create endpoints, see if there's a similar endpoint that another team is using, so that these endpoints are literally going to be the same names and have the same underlying models. That those reusable models really are key, I find, to API consistency. And we'll get a little bit more into why that is. So there's, what do you define in an API council? I think more of that was discussed yesterday. Reiterating that you can discuss more than just what the API standards are, but let's make sure you have those basic requirements there. Okay, great. The API Council now says these are how your API should look. But you don't just get to sit back and relax after you've defined the standards, because in practice, you still have to get teams to adopt the standard. And here, you have to ask, how do you get teams to adopt it? Instinct says, how do we enforce the standard? I don't like to use the term enforce. You may have to, but I like to minimize the use of enforce. And instead, get developers in each of these teams, get your API product teams to really want to design APIs according to this agreed standard. I generally set as a high-level goal for any of these centralized API teams, API standard teams, that your goal really should be to make the developer experience for your community better, and do so by making it easier for your product teams to build APIs that just happen to be more consistent. So how do we make it easier, and how do we get teams to want to actually design APIs according to a standard? And maybe kind of restricting them on what they can do. You're going to be generating more errors. You're going to be creating one more layer for what they get to do and what they don't get to do when planning their APIs. We'll get into tooling in a moment, but basically, to get the standard adopted, there's A, that principle. We want to get them to want to use it. And B, how do you be as supportive as possible? Any standard is only going to get adopted internally if you have proper documentation, proper communication, and proper tooling. From experiencing friction points in getting a standard adopted at many companies, and each company, they have different challenges, I find, with different teams. But ultimately, it's mostly about just making it easier for teams to adopt the standard by understanding what are the resources available, giving them resources to understand what are the requirements of the standard. So that's about providing good, clear documentation internally, and not just assuming that everyone's going to read them because you've created the documents. Provide support, host webinars, interact with teams directly, and help them out with their API design process. That goes to communication. I have seen stronger friction points. I have to emphasize, because I know for those who may have encountered these challenges, you just encounter certain teams who just refuse to go with the standard. They just want to do their own thing. I acknowledge that I've seen those sort of stronger friction points where just some people don't care about the standards. They want to stick to their old ways. Sometimes it's one of the early teams that have the first set of APIs and they don't want to be forced onto anything new. Sometimes a team just doesn't believe in design first APIs. And yes, that happens, and that can be a greater challenge. But I find the vast majority of cases where there's friction or just challenges in getting adoption, they're actually much easier to resolve because they're not really people problems. They instead are just problems around the documentation isn't clear, or certain teams didn't know about the documentation, or they want to align their APIs to your designs. They want to avoid making mistakes, like making changes to their APIs that are breaking changes, but they don't know how to do it. They may have just less experience in APIs, or maybe they just weren't in touch with the API standards team. And most of the time, that's all it is: communication and providing the right resources for each of these teams. And speaking of resources, let's get into some cool tools that help to automate the definition and I don't like to say enforcement, but the adoption of API standards as part of this API governance process. So the biggest and the best tool I'd say is the Linter. It's the most important when it comes to API standards. Basically, the Linter says that in addition to making sure that you have APIs under RESTful principles and a valid open API schema, we can actually automatically warn you if you're not going by the other requirements that we've established in the API Council. There's other rules that are now part of the API standard. Would we say require that your API definitions have samples for properties in your responses? Do we require that each property have a strongly typed format? Would we require that your parameters have a certain kind of casing? Those sort of things aren't caught by your standard validator. If you're using an API editor tool like Stoplight or SmartBear Swagger Hub, they'll let you know if your schema isn't aligned with with the open API standards. But with the Linter, which in practice is often just extending what these editors do with custom rules, you get to actually say what else your companies agree to that needs to be enforced. And Linters can really help to enforce quite a few rules. They are meant, though, to just make the process of designing APIs easier. They tend to fit very nicely into various, even different processes for releasing APIs. Let's say most of your teams are adopting those design first principles, and maybe they're using an API editor like Stoplight so that they first plan out and create an open API schema before they even build the API. Well, in that editor, you can go and check if your designs meet REST requirements, they're meeting the open API standard. But if you use the right linter with your editor, basically teams will be able to know if there's an aspect of their design that's not meeting API standards before you even implement, before you code in any way your APIs. And for teams that aren't actually applying design first principles, or for teams where they're just making some smaller updates, some iterations on an existing API, and they're not manually updating things in Swagger, well, this is the big part of the Linter. It fits right into the CI/CD pipeline. And so as you actually code your API and you're ready to release the API, thanks to the magic of the Linter, it can automatically check and even stop entirely the release pipeline, or just warn a developer if the API that you've implemented has a breaking change or has an issue with the design according to your standard. I mentioned SmartBear's Swagger Hub, which has a good validator, and they also have a Linter under Swagger Hub. So there are many Linter options out there. I haven't seen a definitive standard for API linters, unfortunately, but I would highly recommend, after trying a few, I'm going to recommend that you all try a few. My personal favorite is Spectral. It's an open source project by Stoplight. I find it's very, very flexible in terms of what you can define in your linter. It fits right into Stoplight's API editors, so it works with those teams that are applying design first principles. And of course, it does also fit well into the CI/CD pipeline. So yeah, this is really the biggest thing. That linter, built around OpenAPI, so a schema that can basically help to review and critique the OpenAPI schemas that your teams are creating. What this does, when you have a schema that can give you these warnings, but can also fit very seamlessly into any team's API development process, is that you are giving your teams that freedom to build APIs, to design APIs their way, but still the responsibility to make sure that their APIs are aligned with your standard. To quote the great Austin Powers, the linter makes it a very groovy time. I can't do it with his British accent, though. All right, so the linter really is the big tool. But I also have to note here there's more that we can. There's more to the API schema than just enforcing whether they're aligned with your standards. It's really important to make sure that the various API product teams are in fact working together to make everyone's lives easier. Your developer community, but also make it easier for your teams to actually build your APIs. Again, making it easy. Again, making a solid experience for your developer community by making it easier in general to design these APIs. For instance, if we really want to deal with that issue of a developer building an app that works with various products of yours, like, hey, I'm working with Google Workspace and I have to upload a spreadsheet. I also have Google Slides, a PowerPoint presentation to upload, or I have a document to upload to Google Docs. It is kind of helpful to, there are going to be some differences in the APIs, but when relevant, it is nice to be able to say, take the output return from one API in one product area and use it as the input in another endpoint, even if they're different products. And this can be hard to really coordinate. You can't force teams to talk to each other and coordinate when they're working on different products to magically make sure that their API models are the same. Even if they're designing their APIs with your naming conventions, with your casing requirements. But for any team, they would agree that it's easier to plan to design your APIs when you're able to reuse existing models and not having to reinvent the wheel. So this next bit is about making it easier for teams to share their content. And I find this actually can be very easily done, very easily enforced if teams are working with API editors like SmartBear Swagger Hub or Stoplight or Kong's Insomnia product. Because what you can do with those is if you have this one through the console maintained schema containing, say, the models that you want to be reusable or the endpoints that are meant to be reused, each team can just load that into their editor and they can choose whether to use those models or not. But as they're planning their API, these editors have auto-suggest. So right then and there, if they're planning something, they'll very quickly see that maybe there's something that already exists out there they should try to reuse. Then they don't have to reinvent the wheel, and the developer community now has a much easier time in building apps that work with your APIs as well as the APIs of those other product teams. It's faster to plan, and inherently these APIs are going to work well with others. If we combine that with a means of with a check in your validator, actually, to identify when a new model is in use and evaluating if it's similar to an existing model. This is basically taking that API validator in your process that now has a means of not just checking if you're a valid OpenAPI schema, but applying your linter to check if you're meeting your standards. We can check for other things in the CI/CD pipeline. We can check if you are releasing a new API that includes a new API model. And when that happens, a team can be there to assess, hey, is this model entirely new or is it similar to another model that maybe your team should reuse? So it can actually be one last check to encourage a team to, if they're about to release an API, to, before they do, assess if there's a model that's already being used by other teams they should consider to make it easier for their APIs to work with the other APIs at your company. Yes, there's a little bit more of enforcement here, not just making API models easy to share and easy to adopt, but having that one extra check of, hey, before you release, we noticed you have a new model. Do you really want to do that, or should you actually reuse the stuff that's already out there? Within the API Council, you can actually start to take these models and consolidate a centralized list of, these are the models we want to reuse, and we're going to make it really easy for you to just copy those when you're planning your APIs. Some other factors you may run into in practice as you scale and have these many teams working on APIs. Besides them, let's say they are able to get alignment in API design and they're using these tools and they're actively trying to design their APIs to be aligned. Here are some other fun things to be ready for. Launching APIs when you now have many teams working on APIs. You're probably going to want consistency in your API libraries as well. And thanks to CodeGen and other tools, there are ways of automatically generating API libraries off of your open API definitions. So hey, if every API product team is working on APIs that are consistently designed, they should be able to send it through the same code generator, the same library generator, and you'll see some you'll generally see consistency right off the bat with your API libraries. What I found though in practice is that even if the APIs are properly designed according to your standard, and the schema is a valid open API schema, your documentation generator, your library generator may give you some additional challenges. Basically, something like CodeGen may just have their own additional requirements for what they need in the Open API schema, and maybe beyond your standards and maybe beyond the basic Open API requirements. It's just something to watch out for if you're starting to build this out and you know that you want API library consistency as well, and if every team push their APIs through the same library generator, well, make sure you know what that library generator needs. Document what is needed in OpenAPI to work with your code generator. Likely enforce that in your linter as well, and just make sure that the resources are there for your teams to know what is needed so that documentation is generated properly and that your API libraries are generated properly. Finally, let's get into the biggest tool for API management in general, the API gateway. No good talk of API tooling goes well without the API gateway. It's often the center of any API initiative, although when it comes to API standards, I think the linters are really more important. And I do recommend mixing and matching. Many of these API gateways have their own API linters, but there are different tools out there. It's okay to use Kong or use Azure's API gateway while also trying out Stoplight's API editor or using Kong's API editor. But anyways, with the API gateway, I find if you have a standard for an API gateway, you'll be able to get teams to adopt the same gateway. And what do you get out of that? Well, let's look at what happens if you don't have teams using the same API gateway. They all have their own infrastructure. What could possibly go wrong there? Well, let's talk about rate limiting in those cases. You'll start to find that developers hit a rate limit when they're calling one API, but that limit is enforced for that API. Maybe another API has a completely different rate limit. Maybe you have the same rate limit, but you're not able to really enforce it when developers are calling different APIs and different products if your infrastructure isn't aligned. So there's another aspect I find important in the API Council. Basically, work very closely with infrastructure folk and try to get a consistency, not just in your API designs, but in your API infrastructure. Because if you do that, issues like rate limiting are alleviated. They're much more manageable when teams are using not the same instance of an API gateway, but at least the same API gateway kind. Most of modern API gateways are designed to work with containers, microservices, distributed systems. And so if you get these teams to adopt the same type of API gateway and run different instances, they have a nice coordinated means of enforcing rate limiting across your APIs. So this makes things a lot easier on your DevOps team to make sure there isn't some malicious abuse or even just unintentional issues with a developer that is hitting rate limiting in one API, but then is causing trouble for other APIs. The gateway can also help with analytics. I've seen this at a few companies when you have different teams building out their APIs, even if the designs are the same. The means by which they're monitoring the APIs, by which they're logging API activity for your own analytics gets difficult. And a data science team is going to find that the code to just collect all the data requires custom code for each API. That may be difficult to enforce. Certain teams may be better about it than others. So just bringing everything into a central place, you can monitor your APIs, you can analyze API usage. Well, that gets a lot easier when you have one API gateway. These gateways have built-in analytics or they have plugins. But once you have everyone on the same gateway, yeah, it's a lot easier to get everyone on the same system for analytics. And then maintenance becomes much, much, much less of a pain when you're trying to look holistically at the health of your developer platform across your various product lines. All right. I definitely want to save time for Q&A, but I got a few extra minutes to talk about what the future may hold. Because I would still say that we're just starting to see automated tooling and the benefits and what you can really accomplish when you have all these tools around standards, around the open API schema. And if we continue to think creatively, I think we'll find other ways we can actually help, both with API design and with API governance. A big thing I find helpful when it comes to API governance is API decoration. Tools that can just help you out in tweaking your API definitions. Maybe there's a team whose APIs weren't strongly defined. All their properties were strings. Just because it was an older API and they want to create a new API to your standards, well, hey, there's an inflector tool out there that if you have the right kind of mapping, it can, to an extent, automatically get your loosely typed APIs to a semi-strongly typed API. I've even whipped up a tool at one point that helps teams, if they just create their API model definition first, to auto-generate the API endpoints. When you have something like this, it makes it easier to plan out your APIs, to get your APIs good to go. But if everyone's using the same decorator tools, those decorators are going to help to make sure that there is a certain consistency to your API definitions as well. Finally, I am a big fan of abstraction. When we look at Open API today, it's JSON, it's YAML. And whenever there's anything in JSON YAML, I like to put some sort of an interface on top of it. This we're seeing in API editors in general. They started with just, type Open API definitions directly, but now they're providing some forms, some inputs where they prompt you as to how you want to define your models and then how you want to define your endpoints. Which endpoints do you want? They can auto-generate much of the Swagger schema in an underlying layer. Now, these linters are usually just JSON and YAML as well, at least Spectral by Stoplights is. And so could there be an interface to actually define your API standard as well? Well, it turns out Stoplight actually has already been working on this, and I'm not sure when they released it, but I did see in recent months, they now have an interface on top of their linter. So you can actually, via UI, define both your API and if you're creating a standard to actually work on an API standard. So you define it in your console, and then in a form you say, this is how it's going to work. Take a look at the subsequent JSON or YAML format, your preference, and just tweak it from there. And then you have a linter that can enforce your standards. So hopefully we're going to see more in automation of planning and designing and enforcing your API standards to make it easier and easier for API consistency and easier for a growing enterprise to still plan, implement, and launch solid APIs across the board. With the magic of a decentralized egalitarian system for establishing your standard and the tools behind it, this becomes possible for those growing enterprises. Thank you all for your time today. I think we are at time. We have 10 minutes for Q&A, correct?
Yes. And I know that I absolutely enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. I think I am also a little biased considering I used to be a stoplighter. So, and one question that came up was the fact of, you mentioned how important it is for design first. And so many companies have a hard time conceptualizing design first when instead of code first, and not having someone else create that documentation. And especially for companies that are scaling, that are, have done code first the entire time, like that's almost mind-boggling. Where do you even start to go design first?
Yeah. So there's the principle of, why design first versus code first. And there are plenty of other talks here at API Days on that, I'm sure. I've given talks on that in the past. So one thing that I've emphasized in like a preceding talk to this one is, besides scaling, there's getting just applying design first principles and the tooling behind it. And I do find tooling does help. We're talking about Stoplight today. It's about Stoplight's linter. But Stoplight's API editor, Stoplight invested a lot in making it easy to design an API and then auto-generating documentation accordingly. So I can always talk about the principles as to why design first works. And long story short, you see it in practice. The Twilio, Stripe, all the top companies with successful APIs, they were design first. This is where even I'm hesitant to say, it's all about API product management. As an API product manager, I do think it's about most importantly, applying product principles to APIs. But I'll concede you don't even need a product manager at times. Stripe had, I think, 300 employees before they had a product manager. This was by engineers for engineers, but those engineers had customer empathy or developer empathy. They weren't taking the APIs that they had used internally and just opening those up. They were still thinking about what does the external developer community need. I knew some early developers over there, and you can see that they always thought what makes sense for the developer community. So in principle, I teach, it's not about product, it's about developer empathy. What does your community need? And then from there, specifying, why would then a common thing is, why is an external API different from an internal API?
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't necessarily say that you should have internal APIs and external APIs completely separate. I know experts who say that, and there is a case for it, and I, to an extent, support it, but not fully. But I do say that you can't just take APIs built off your database and then slap documentation on there and release it, because those APIs are often about performance. And they're just not going to work well. If you think about what as a developer am I trying to do, you'll find that the APIs do need to be designed differently. Besides, so I've given talks about why design first principles, and then also talks on the tooling that makes it easier. And one other aspect besides tooling like Stoplight is as we moved actually towards domain-driven design. Domain-driven design, I find it's a nice layer on top of your database. You're not just creating APIs that are baked into your database. There's one more abstraction layer. And I think that actually helps to position APIs with design first principles, as you already go there from an infrastructure standpoint. Emphasizing, though, that the APIs from domain-driven principles are not necessarily going to work as external APIs either. In practice, what I've seen is the majority of APIs under domain-driven principles do actually work as external APIs, but you do still need something there when it comes to what are the use cases to say, the external APIs should go into your lower layer, maybe those domain APIs. But that layer, when you have domain-driven design, it does get thinner.
Yeah.
So I learned to come in with developer empathy to say, everything you've built is good, it's solid, and we can use this stuff. There's just this last bit about what makes sense for the developer community. And it doesn't mean to say that we're coding all this stuff and completely ignoring what you've done. But with some tooling, especially with that API gateway that can even automate much of the API implementation, API error handling, and all that it can actually often plug right into your domain APIs with very little code. That it does allow you, I even say this is low code, no code for API planning.
Mm-hmm.
That then what you've built is most of the way there. And there's just a little layer there to make sure that everything that's been built just fits perfectly for the external API use case.
And thank you for that. And I think that was a great explanation. One thing that does come to mind is, oh goodness, I know I'm going to totally butcher his name. Matthew Greenbold really talks about developer empathy and the empathy that you don't even need to have for other developers, but the consumer on the end of it, and just thinking about the layers of empathy. And this is a great point to bring it up because you talk about designing it all first and just the practices of it, not just a product, but the practices of it, and thinking about having empathy for all of your stakeholders, not only your developers, and being able to move going forward to implement all of these, because it can be a huge daunting task. So thank you again. And I would say the only last question that we have is, do you have resources that you would suggest to really find out more? I'm guessing you have the resources too, but any books or videos that you would also suggest to being able to really find out more, not only from overall the scaling to enterprise of APIs, but maybe where to start in more detail if you are already have existing multitude of APIs?
Yeah, so when it comes to like documentation and guides, there are the API communities. There are some books out there. My favorites are like within O'Reilly. Who's it? He spoke to Mike Amundsen. He also spoke here on API governance.
Yes.
I think he wrote both a book on domain-driven design at O'Reilly and a book on external API design, RESTful API designs for O'Reilly. So those I find are very helpful in just like the full stack, getting ready for an API, including design first principles. What I also do is just Google design first principles for APIs. I will admit it's still kind of new. The books here, I think, are going to need some more iteration. At least what I've read. I haven't read much in the last year and a half, admittedly. It's been a wacky year. But if you just Google like design first principles, there are articles, there are books. When it comes to API governance, I unfortunately don't have a book to recommend. But there are articles. I've just been involved in the community and gathering like what makes sense for API governance. Hopefully more will be published over time. Maybe some stuff has been published. In terms of tooling, what I recommend is, first really look around because a lot of these things are getting updated regularly. But I'm a big fan of Kong's products in general in terms of just a solid API gateway. And I'm a big fan of Stoplight. There are other API editors out there. What I have seen is that Stoplight has just they've been the most innovative, the most visionary, I think, and just what else can we do to make the process of designing APIs or planning your API governance, what can we do to make it easier? But there's also, SmartBear Swagger Hub that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
And many of these API gateways have their own API editors. So I would just keep a lookout because there's a lot of experimentation from all these teams and what may just make sense.
And thank you for that. I would also say before, and I believe this is just echoing something that you said, of having a small team try it out before implementing it across, because Stoplight might be the best fit, Swagger Hub, Kong, try them out before you really decide, kind of like trying on clothes. Let's try on, some API editors. And once again, thank you, Jeremy, for joining us today. This was a phenomenal speech, and I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. I was happy to be here, and thank you all for putting up with me for 50 minutes.